Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I've Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And welcome to a long-awaited episode that we're doing on women, referees, and coaches. A brief content warning for sexist language. Samantha, when you look back in your experience, did you see or have more male coaches or female coaches?
Well, so the only sports I really participated in was cheerleading. So for that, I only had women coaches for those. But I will say when I was watching my friends who competed in tennis and in cross country, it was all men. Now that I'm thinking about it, the more and more that the few, and even for like women's basketball, girls basketball, we had a whole issue with inappropriate behavior from our coach who was beloved. But then it's easily like those beloved coaches are the ones like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. He's a little too close to the students. But anyway, it was a dude. Obviously, as I say this. But yeah, I think now that I'm thinking about it, even for the girls teams or like mixed teams, it was all typically men. And the ones that were highly regarded were always men, like even outside of like, again, a couple of the cheerleading squads.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I think looking back, I did a couple of sports that were more leaning towards girls. So like gymnastics, that was all women. But when I got into high school, I was really insecure, therefore I didn't compete in sports. But so most of the coaches I saw when other people were competing were men. There were a couple of outliers, and they were women who were very beloved. But also, yeah, we had a lot of with those men coaches. There were just rumors of them being kind of creepers. So, and it was just accepted. It was just like, oh, yeah, yep, that's how they are. But my school was also pretty small. So was yours, right? Yours was very small.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking about how many. I think like we had 100 and I think ours was bigger than yours. So like 130 people graduate in my class. There was only one high school, I believe, in the entire county.
Yeah. I seem to recall I had a 91 number of graduating people in my class, but I don't know. I could be wrong. That's the number that I've
like time.
It's been a while. That's the number that stands out to me. But yeah, I just feel mostly women coaches in my experience were like outliers. And there weren't really referees in my experience. This episode, listeners, was what I'll call a folly on my part, because I was like, surely this will be a simple one to put together. It wasn't. And in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and put a disclaimer up here. You could break down the history of coaches and referees in pretty much every sport, and it could be a full episode. There has been a lot of research into it. So today we are going to be talking about some of the history, specifically in the realm of football/soccer and American football issues and potential solutions. This is by no means comprehensive. I'm actually really impressed at how many detailed sources that I found looking to this. But a lot of it is recent. A lot of it is very, very recent.
Of course.
Yes. And we're going to talk about that soon, because a lot of the first I was like, oh, really? Last year.
Yep. Yep.
Yep.
Which sucks.
It does suck. And it does have, it's important. It is important. So to start, I tried to find like a general definition of a coach and referee. People don't really seem to agree on even that. So basically, I would say coach is someone who guides and supports athletes, usually on a team. There are no consistent guidelines or requirements, though it often involves getting a coaching and teaching license and perhaps other credentials. that can look very differently depending on the sport, depending on where you are. Referees. This was even less less regulated from what I could find. Please, if anyone is a coach or referee professionally or not, write in. But yes, they're basically monitoring the game, watching for any like breaking of rules or something like that. And to become one, it seemed like it was sort of all over the place based on the sport, but basically you have to pass a rules exam and then you sort of work your way up from the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it sounded like.
Mm-hmm.
Then I discovered, I knew about this, but I don't know why I've never thought about it. The people who watch the like videos.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a whole separate thing we're going to have to come back to because women are just breaking grounds in that as well.
Right. Mm-hmm. We're not even talking about commentators and how much they make. Mm-hmm. Like Tom Brady just got millions of dollars of a contract to work with Fox Sports. So,
yeah, there's a lot to talk about here.
That's a whole different world. But of course, all of this means, all of this is conversations about how much money is and can be made in this industry and who it's given to. But again, we'll come back to that later. But before we do all of that, let's talk about a little bit of stats. A little bit of stats, Anney, or a couple, quick ones. So when it comes to the U.S., as of 2022, about 30% of high school varsity coaches were women compared to 70% of men, which is more than I thought it would be, to be very honest, especially in high schools, because they're pretty competitive. High school is an interesting level. I mean, come on, Friday Night Lights. They made hit shows based on coaching and teams in high schools, but whatever. Now, according to The Conversation, quote, today, men occupy nearly 75% of all head coaching positions in collegiate athletics. Again, lower than I thought. I would have thought it was 90%, but The BBC recently reported that the number of women's referees in English football had increased by 72% as of 2016, and that was in 2020. Huh. Really?
Yeah. We're going to talk about that in a second, but I do want to clarify. The English football is important because it was specifically about England. Yes.
Which is, I haven't watched a lot of English football, soccer, I'm assuming, recently, and I've yet to see a woman being a referee, so that's interesting.
Oh, it's pretty recent.
Okay.
We'll talk about it.
Okay, let's go.
Yes, but I did want to put in here before we get into it a quick note about why it matters, because I think one thing that can't be quite captured in a definition is the power and impact of a good coach or a good referee, both in terms of fostering athletes but in seeing that like, oh, I belong. Having women in these positions normalizes women's participation. It says like women are supposed to be here. It also allows for athletes to grow once they stop competing. And there's so much talent that is getting lost because these pathways don't really exist right now for women. Or if they do, they're so crowded that women are getting pushed out.
Mm-hmm.
So it is important.
Or bullied out.
Yeah, or bullied out. Mm-hmm. So yes, as we go into, we're mostly going to talk about soccer, football, and American football. But yes, please forgive us because the history section is a bit cobbled together because sports history looks different all around the world and it looks different in different sports. Also worth noting, in multiple cases, at some point or another, women were prohibited from competing officially in sports, which is pretty much how people become professional coaches and referees. So there's a lot of catching up to do in that sense. Yes. Okay. But let us look at soccer/football. While football has a long history of being popular, patriarchal systems have often sought to keep women out, both as players and in any leadership or officiate positions. For instance, women were banned from playing on official football league pitches in 1921. Their official reason was that it was dangerous for women. We've talked about this before. She can't sweat. what about our uterus?
It's going to fall out.
It's going to fall
Every
out.
time.
These are
Every
real
time.
things.
Mhm.
The unofficial reason was that they didn't want women to threaten a, quote, men's sport.
However, women's soccer has really taken off in recent years with a huge explosion of popularity. Attendance records have been broken, as have viewership records, and the skills on display are just as astounding. Still, when it comes to women coaching the sport, we're still lagging behind. Only 1/3 of women's Super League coaches have a woman manager. The National Women's Soccer League, or NWSL, has 14 clubs and only 5 are led by women.
Mm-hmm. Austria's Edith Klinger is believed to be the first woman to referee both men and women's games in 1935. However, FIFA officially recognized Turkey's Tristan Arda as the world's first football woman referee. She refereed her first match in 1968 after years of training. Although FIFA is very it has to be a FIFA event, so that makes sense to me.
Right.
Betty Ellis was the first woman to officiate a professional U.S. soccer game in 1981. And then in 1991, we saw the first all-women team to officiate a FIFA tournament. Earlier, Claudia Vasconcelos became the first woman to referee an official FIFA event at the first Women's World Cup. So the reason this kind of came out later because FIFA, again, wasn't sure if it was an official event. They were like, Women's World Cup. But then when they later were like, okay, it was an official event, then it was like she kind of retroactively got the recognition. Just a handful of years later, we got the first woman to be designated as the first official FIFA-accredited referee.
So one woman who recently has been the source of a lot of coverage is Emma Hayes, who after coaching the team in Chelsea, went on to coach the U.S. women's national team and led them to gold. She has been very vocal about the lack of women coaches and all the reasons she thinks that is. Things like cost and the gender wage gap, lack of education and attention, and lack of mentors, which we talked about with the Olympics.
Yes. Mm-hmm. In 2020, in part because of COVID, the CONMEBOL, CONMEBOL, Copa Libertadores, the highest level of competition in South American club football, was the first game to feature only women referees. The video match officials were also women, meaning the entirety of the officiating team was composed of women. And I will say, it's kind of unfortunate, but a lot of this did happen during COVID because men were getting COVID.
Yeah.
So it was sort of like whoever could step up. And these women were definitely qualified, do not get me wrong, but it was like all the men were sick.
Mm-hmm.
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 In 2022, Stephanie Frappart became the first woman to officiate a men's World Cup game. She also had a bunch of other firsts. She had 2 women assistants, too, at this time. Nusa Back of Brazil and Karen Diaz Medina of Mexico. And yeah, there are still firsts happening in 2023. The first woman was appointed to coach a professional British football team. I saw something today because, of course, when you're researching something like this, you start getting news updates all the time.
Right.
About other firsts that are happening. So it's one of those things where I'm kind of I'm happy, but I'm shocked that I'm oh, really? This is in 2024.
Finally, okay. I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is the briefest of overview of women coaches and referees in soccer. Let us look at American football. So this was interesting to me. American football, the rules and sport were formalized in the 1870s, and one of the main stated goals of this sport was to reinforce and shore up what was believed to be fading manliness in white Anglo-Saxon men due to increased immigration and the closed frontier. But even in these early days, women were present as coaches. The so-called father of football, Walter Camp, often missed practices and his wife Alice would take his place. She took these like really intense notes. She made play suggestions. The team, who were undefeated in 1888, considered her a coach on the same level as her husband. At a reunion celebration 25 years later, both she and her husband were labeled head coaches. So women were there. Whether they were getting the credit necessarily, different story, but they were there. And she was not the only one. Prior to World War I, a roster of American women coached men's football teams. From the Washington Post, names like Lillian Merrill, Annie Bragdon, Estelle Sherwin, Carrie Brookhart, and Cosette Brannon were all there. Two of them, Bragdon and Burkhart, boasted undefeated seasons. At the time, one of the main aspects of this sport was its violence. It was something that journals wrote about, including injuries and even death. So these women coaching such a violent sport broke accepted Western gender stereotypes in multiple ways. Generally, they coached school-aged teams. Women did pretty much anything above that. In the rare case it happened was usually because of lack of funding to pay for a male coach or something like that. A second choice, like woman, that's the second choice. Women were still viewed as largely spectators to the men being manly and somewhat of a calming influence in the audience.
Okay.
Yeah. This actually was a thing in a lot of Western countries, regardless of sports, as were sexist, racist, ableist, and homophobic guidelines designed to keep marginalized people out or harassing them if they somehow managed to participate.
Right. So that shifted a bit during World War I, when men went away to fight the war and women stepped up into their positions as coaches. A story as old as time in high schools and college positions. The same thing happened during World War II, and some of these coaches won titles. Once the men returned from the war, many of the women were forced out, though some remained coaching for many more years. Go back to the league of their own. That's that whole scenario, yeah? Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Some reporters from the time described these women coaches as radical and strange. Their husbands were often pointedly mentioned as if to reassure folks that they are still straight women in the domestic sphere, or even crediting their husbands with the women's knowledge and talent. Yeah, when Pauline Foster's team beat a team coached by a man, it was reported on with almost amusement, like he'll never live down this embarrassment, as opposed to crediting her talent, which they often did attribute to her husband. And of course, the physical appearances of the women coaches was a point of attention too, in a way that it wasn't for men. Descriptions like beautiful, attractive, and buxom blonde were pretty standard.
That word buxom, that gets me every time.
Yeah. After a bit of a dead period for women American football coaches, 1972's Title IX put in place rules to foster equality in women's sports in education settings. But this mostly pertained to athletes and not coaches or referees. Women coaches were still met with suspicion and derision. Some universities and institutions even had in place rules that prohibited women from holding these positions, even assistant coaching positions. Before Title IX, 90% of intercollegiate women's teams were coached by women, largely unpaid. However, after Title IX, there was a huge growth in teams, and men started to take these roles thanks to biases. And also, the roles were now paid. So, now men were like, oh, yeah, I'll take that job. Right. In 2014, women accounted for only 43% of these positions. Mm-mm. So basically, now women's teams were getting money, they were getting resources, and suddenly men saw it as a legitimate career path to coach these teams.
Of course.
Yep. I did find some arguments that first and second wave feminism were in part to blame for the unintended consequences of the lower number of women coaches and refs. And the argument goes that these movements wanted women's sports under women's spheres, all women's clubs, perhaps specific rules. It was interesting. I was like, I guess. I don't know. It was an interesting argument. Yes, a few women were able to break through, including Carol White, who worked with kickers at my alma mater, Georgia Tech, as a graduate assistant in 1986. Some say this makes her the first woman to coach in an NCAA Division I football tournament. People do like to argue about all this stuff, though, which is probably not a surprise. Another thing people argue about, when Natalie Randolph started coaching a men's high school football team in 2010, she was widely celebrated as the first woman coach of a men's high school team. But if you've been listening to the history section, others will say, no way, that can't be true. I think it's more of a in our recent times kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In 2020, there were a lot of headlines about history being made around women refs and coaches in NFL football. That season, there were 12 women coaches working. It was the first Super Bowl to feature 2 women coaches. And Sarah Thomas became the first woman referee to officiate a Super Bowl game. She also previously had broken other firsts, including becoming the first full-time woman referee for the NFL. And yeah, the case of American football is interesting because women don't play it professionally. Mm-hmm. So there's not a pipeline of player to coach.
Right.
Yeah. Yep, that's also could be broken down into a much bigger episode because there's still a lot of first happening there.
Mm-hmm.
But let us talk about some of the issues here that we found when researching this. One, no surprise, harassment. One of the biggest barriers women have reported in these positions is sexism and harassment from players, spectators, and other officials. Here are some examples from Forbes. Quote, if women want equal rights, then they need to learn how to referee. And from an amateur football coach, she should not be here. I know that sounds sexist, but I am sexist. And if you start bringing in women, you have big problems. A senior vice president of the Football Association once said, a woman's place is in the kitchen and not on a football field.
I love that that's their go-to. It's always the kitchen. Always.
Yes.
They're really hungry.
We're going to talk about this in a minute, but that comes up all the time. The go back to the kitchen argument.
Right. Every time. Here's another quote from a referee named Anne. Things like, don't you know the supermarket is open? You should be there doing the shopping. Or why aren't you at home cooking your husband's meals? Or you should be pregnant at the kitchen sink. Or the worst one was, I hope your children die of cancer. That was from a spectator. I remember one game, an FA Cup round, and I walked off and my daughter came running over to where the tunnel area was and she said, Mommy, what's a dike? She was only about 10 or 11 at the time, and I said, why, honey? And she said, because the man over there, he's been calling you one the whole game. Ugh.
Yikes. Many women in these positions have reported they are, quote, aware of their token status and the damage that does to their mental health. There have been multiple instances of verbal and physical abuse and threats in these fields. The verbal sexist abuse is the most observed. Many did say the abuse only became sexist when people disagreed with a call.
Right.
In the case of a referee.
Right.
And one study, every single woman referee interviewed reported having heard get back in the kitchen. So yes, that is their go-to. That is their number one. And actually, it's like really depressing, but it's kind of a funny story because one of the people from the study confronted one of the men who said it. And he came down and he was so contrite and he was like, I don't know why I said it. I'm so sorry. And she was like, don't ever do that again and get out of here.
What the hell? Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. Yeah. But it can get a lot darker. One person described basically threats of rape as an assistant referee. She was 16 and she almost dropped out because of this experience. And the article was detailing basically all of the fallout and damage of things like this and the loss of talent and women participating if this is what is normalized and accepted. Because, yeah, perhaps even more upsetting in a way is some women did not recognize verbal sexist abuse, suggesting it has been so normalized. They were just like, oh, that didn't think about it, which is sad.
Right.
Others have reported not having places to change. And when asking about it, management giving them like a storage cupboard or something. So that's not great. Also, just being dismissed or not respected. A lot of people reported that referees always assuming that the man is the head coach. One woman in one of these surveys said, when you make a mistake, it's because you're a woman. And yet there is sort of this other side of it of being labeled as not feminine enough.
Right.
So like you made that mistake because you're a woman, but you're not feminine.
Right.
Assumptions that they don't know the rules. There have been multiple instances of male commentators, like we talked about our Olympics episodes, basically saying she's a woman, she doesn't know what she's doing. And these are like the commentators you're listening to during the game.
Right.
Yeah. Stereotypes around physical and mental ability and inability to handle pressure, a lot of people reported.
Right. So here's a quote that sums it up pretty well. The study's findings demonstrate that men's gendered identities afford them automatic and unquestioned access to the social dynamics of the coach education system. Women, on the other hand, have to earn this through their performance of appropriate levels of football knowledge and skill, and these expectations often go far beyond the level of performance required by men to gain the same credibility.
Yes. And just as always, there's discrimination around having children that could get pregnant.
Right.
I read one that was basically a male interviewer was like, oh, you don't want this job. You'll have to work on the weekends. You'll have kids. You got to take care of the kids. Like, okay. And here's something, this is kind of more complicated. I'll talk about why in a second. But examples show women coaches are more likely to get fired for similar behaviors male coaches exhibit and are lauded for. Women coaches are less likely to be renewed despite a track record for success. So for instance, despite helping secure multiple national championships for the University of Minnesota Duluth women's hockey, head coach Shannon Miller's contract was not renewed in 2014. She didn't have any violations or anything, and she sued for gender discrimination, a suit she ended up winning and was awarded $3 million.
Gotta get that money.
Gotta get that money. In a lot of instances where women coaches are fired for abuse, they are never rehired, or if they are, not at the same level. The same is not true for men. They don't usually get fired, and if they do, they get rehired at an equal or even better position. So I'm not advocating for this abuse, but the punishment should be equal, and that is not what we're seeing. Nope, it is not what we're seeing at all. There are a lot of toxic old gender stereotypes here that basically boil down to traditionally masculine coded traits are better, but when a woman displays those traits, she is judged far more harshly. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about here is like a coach yelling at you, and it can be very abusive and has been. But it's seen as like when men do that, oh, yeah, he's talking up his team. But when a woman does it, it's like, oh, look at this shrew. She's got to go. Again, I'm not condoning abuse. I don't think it's right, but just saying. Here's a quote from the conversation. Another problem is that female college athletes seem to value coaches who act in dominant, sometimes authoritarian ways. When female athletes are asked what they want in a coach, they'll say they want someone who's commanding, confident, assertive, and knowledgeable. At the same time, female athletes consider ideal female coaches to be caring, supportive, and nurturing. But this contradicts what they value in a coach. Female coaches ultimately find themselves in a double bind. They're damned if they act like men and damned if they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Another issue, of course, equal pay. Many women coaches and referees are not getting paid what they're worth, not even close. There's also a persistent idea that there's more respect to be had coaching men's teams, which I found in some articles even when I was looking into this. There's a lack of standards and professionalization in these fields. There's unequal resources usually given towards women athletes. and women coaches and women referees, all of that stuff. Nepotism and name recognition is a problem, like gatekeeping is a problem here. The risk of retaliation if you report something. There's been several cases of that, of women coaches or referees reporting wrongdoing and being retaliated against.
Mm.
And often they might be told, just deal with it.
Right. So from SageBub, quote, among other inequities, women coaches have lower salaries, fewer opportunities, poorer working conditions and relationships, and more conflicts between coaching and family commitments than their male counterparts due to lack of organizational policies and cultural norms. The underrepresentation of women coaches is associated with power relations in sports, which is considered as a male-dominated social context where men occupy dominant social roles over women, hegemonic masculinity. Still, coaching is heavily associated with male characteristics, and women are considered invaders when holding positions of power.
Yes, right. And as always, there are intersectional issues here too. Coaches of color, Black coaches, queer coaches, all have faced unique issues of backlash and discrimination. Marginalized people have increased obstacles to entry and have to deal with a whole host of issues that many of their counterparts don't. And there has been some recent stuff looking into this, but again, a lot of this is pretty recent. And a lot of these first, even in these like specific intersectional areas, are very, very recent. So a lot more to be done. And speaking of, people are looking into this because all of this that we've been talking about has a negative impact on women's mental health, women in sport in general. I would say sport in general, just women's participation. So a couple things that organizing bodies and people involved are looking into are new regulations, like creating minimum standards of women, marginalized folks in these positions, bringing more women to the table when making these regulations in the first place, because that has not happened really. Requiring marginalized people are interviewed for leadership positions. Some have reported organizations outright mocking or ignoring this, though. So, yep. Organizations fostering mentoring and training. So we talked about this pretty recently. So it has been something that's been tried, but it's hard to track. It's hard to quantify, I guess, the benefits of this. But many have said who have participated in it that this helps women feel seen and heard and often allows for more open conversation. Like maybe they will talk to a mentor who is a woman as opposed to a man because they don't feel like they can talk to men about something. Compiling more research, getting more research so that we can have more educated regulations that we can put in place. And as we've said recently, as more women athletes enter the playing field, more of them become coaches and referees, and that continues. So that's good. Like we are seeing growth, but there's still all of these issues to deal with, and there's still so much further to go.
Right.
Yeah.
Way too much.
Yeah. Yes. But to everyone who's doing that work, thank you so much. Honestly, the power of a good coach and a good referee that can really stick with you, especially as a kid. And you're like, oh, yes, can really make you want to keep going. Or even if it's not in the same sport, it can just be something that's really inspiring. So yes, listeners, if you are involved in either coaching or refereeing or sports in general, any of this, please let us know. You can write to us at stephaniemomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff One Never Told You. We're also on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer Christina, our executive producer Maya, and our contributor Joey.
Thank you.
Thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.